It is 60 years since controversial human rights activist Malcolm X made a famous visit to Smethwick. The words he spoke while on Marshall Street had a profound impact.
Residents on the street were struggling with the number of immigrants, and people moving to the area from abroad were met with a racist backlash. Pablo Taylor has been looking back at the time Malcolm X spent in the Midlands and how Marshall Street has changed since. His report does contain racist language and terminology of its time.
It would be easy to walk down this street in Smethwick without ever realising its significance. It might be quiet today, but exactly 60 years ago it was the focus of the nation's attention in a fierce row over immigration and segregation.
Marshall Street, this row of terrace cottages, then due east for 250 yards. An unlikely looking street to have the most publicised name in Britain this week.
Faced with a growing number of black and Asian neighbours, residents here had banded together to ask the council to buy up the remaining properties and reserve them for white families.
This delegation to the council was purely to try and make a stand to stop the road completely being taken over by coloured people.
The families often speak little English.
Their movement had been fuelled by derogatory claims about the habits of non-whites.
They use the back gardens for toilets. I don't think they know what the toilets are for.
They're just living in their own little communities and living how they lived, probably in India or wherever it was they came from, and the standard of living is very low.
It was into this toxic climate of prejudice and racism that the controversial civil rights activist Malcolm X travelled to Smethwick. The American had built up a reputation for the way he'd urged black people to protect themselves using violence if necessary.
We've reached the point now where our people must form self-defense units with which we can defend ourselves against the southern racists.
He'd been invited to Smethwick by this man, Avtar Singh Joel, one of the leaders of the Indian Workers Association. His son Jagwant told me why his dad was so keen for the American to come.
As my father said then, was because of Malcolm's notoriety internationally, and because he had also at that sort of time started linking the dots between what was happening in Sharpsville in South Africa, in Alabama related to segregation and voting rights, and what was happening here. There's all part of the same, what we call the nexus of racism around the world.
What actually happened then when Malcolm X got here?
He was met on that side of the street by my father, but Malcolm wanted to walk by himself. He was looking at the street and what was in the windows, and there were signs that blacks need not apply for the rental for the houses. There's a Caribbean gentleman painting his house, so he stopped and had a chat with him, and then walked back down the street where he was questioned by the press.
Malcolm X went on to compare the treatment of non-whites in Smethwick to that of the Jewish community in Nazi Germany. He warned people not to wait for the fascists here to build gas chambers.
That's a really strong kind of thing to say, to make those associations with the Holocaust. And I think what he does is he really appeals to a sense of shame, I think, about, are we really going to let this happen? Are we going to keep seeing this kind of, politics play out again? What are we going to do?
His words were to have huge consequences. Only 4 months before Malcolm X's visit in the 1964 general election, the country had swung from Conservative to Labour. But Smethwick had gone the opposite direction, electing the Conservative Peter Griffiths in what became known as Britain's most racist election. His win had come off the back of a slogan so offensive we can't repeat it, but his time in power was short-lived.
What happens with Malcolm X coming, I think strong messages are sent out that we will not accept this kind of, and they call it racialism. And I think the fact that in 1966, when there is that snap election, that Peter Griffiths was only in power for 2 years. And actually, I think that is a victory.
So we have two documents here.
But But as well as Malcolm X's visit, the warming of relations on Marshall Street owed much to the actions of the Indian Workers Association, whose letters of goodwill were delivered to every white resident. In them, they argued that any dispute could be resolved through peaceful conversation.
What the Indian Workers Association and what a lot of the campaigners will never forget is that if you want to change the world, you have to go and talk individually to people. What you see over the year is more and more people who are tolerant of the black people of colour moving in, who are not racist, voicing their opinions a lot more.
Tensions about immigration in Britain remain, but on Marshall Street at least, things have undoubtedly improved. Neville Bailey is one of the few old enough to remember what Smethwick was like in the 60s, when pubs often refused to serve people of colour.
They would blatantly say no. Or they'd say, actually say get out. Simple as, straightforward as that then.
So you'd say things are much better now?
Yeah, well, yeah, it is good now, because now it's everybody live together and get on.
Malcolm X was assassinated just 9 days after his visit to Smethwick, shot down whilst giving a speech in New York. But here on Marshall Street, his legacy as a fierce campaigner and defender of racial justice lives on. Pablo Taylor, ITV News.